Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Pallardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great show for you. We've got a couple articles. Why my nonprofit has no executive director. An interesting article on kind of a democratized kind of executive branch of a nonprofit. Why it could work for your nonprofit. We have some opinions on it. Actually, some personal experience from a democratized executive group. We'll talk about all of that and the pros and cons to it and how it could work in your organization. And then next article is reimagining the request for proposal. Those horrible RFPs you always have to submit for grants, contracts, auditors, tax preparers, what reimagining looks like, what are some ways that we could change the process to make it more inclusive, and how it affects your nonprofit when you're applying for grants, contracts, auditors, tax preparation. We'll talk about pros and cons of all of that. Then navigating nonprofit messaging and negative stereotypes. Is your nonprofit's kind of marketing effort correctly giving dignity to who you serve and the population of your nonprofit's outreach and programs? Interesting article on kind of, taking a step back and looking at your marketing material and how you represent those you serve. And if you're representing them with dignity and how you can represent them with dignity. Really interesting article, something I hadn't thought about. And we'll talk about it in this episode. And then for our questions of the week, we have more than one. A couple questions on QuickBooks and your organization. First, who should have access to it? How many people? Who? When? Where? We'll talk about our opinions on who should have access to your QuickBooks and view it and who can edit it and what that looks like. And then using your QuickBooks to manage your nonprofit. What does up-to-date accounting information mean? How you can support your program staff better through budgets to actuals and how to perform that and manage that either in or out of QuickBooks. We'll talk about all that this week on our episode of Profitless on Purpose. But Mark, you have our first article. Why don't you take it away?
Hey, thanks, AJ. Yeah, today's first article is from Nilufar Konsari. Sorry for the pronunciation. Why my nonprofit has no executive director. This is from Nonprofit Quarterly. And this is a little bit of a different take on a nonprofit that this woman runs, where she has made the decision to basically democratize the executive structure in the organization and to no longer have a specific executive director. So she goes through basically her story about how she has a vision of shared power, because oftentimes, I would say in most nonprofits I've seen, there's kind of a hierarchy where you have your executive director at the top, and then it trickles down from there, which of course has its traditional strengths of having one person, the buck stops there, but it also has its weaknesses where things can get log jammed. And the article goes into depth as to why sometimes having that hierarchical structure is more an ego boost to the executive director, and because funders are so used to having that sort of framework organizational structure that becomes the norm and is what is expected, right? If you're going out for a grant, they're going to ask you who your ED is. They're going to ask you, key positions, et cetera, et cetera. But her suggestion is that kind of making the structure of the leadership organization more diversified and breaking it down a little bit allows us to treat people more humanely and more dignified. And in her organization, decisions were made by consensus and leadership roles were rotated so that no one person could stay in power too long, and no importance was placed on titles and status, but rather they're just all there to get the work done. And this governance is happening through a distributed structure. They call it democratic or participatory governance, and they say it's proven to work. It's more resilient in economic downturns and more efficient than top-down corporate structures. She doesn't really provide much evidence of that. She just kind of says that in passing. So I don't know if there are enough of these organizations where there's been studies that show that that's the case. But I can see where, obviously, if you're relying on one person for all sorts of big decisions to funnel through, sometimes you can have a logjam. But I could also see the other side where if you have consensus building, what if nobody ever comes to a consensus and then you just sit there like our current state of politics and nothing ever gets done? So it was an interesting exercise in seeing how we like the people who are at the forefront of thinking on nonprofits and different ways of doing things. And that's, I think, why we chose this article this week. But I'm curious, AJ, what some of your thoughts were when you read this.
My thoughts on executive socialism. No, actually, I actually have a story. I feel I'm kind of an early adopter of this. I was on a board for a local museum, and man, they would cycle through EDs like, handkerchiefs in allergy season, but they had a real problem retaining talent. And the organization was really suffering. What they did have was a good core of managers or directors, say. And so when my final term on that board, I suggested that there was a man and a woman that were running the educational programs over there, and they were kind of jockeying to see who was going to take the executive director role. And I suggested to both of them that they co-executive direct and kind of rotate that role. And what it would do is, instead of having like what they're talking about, more of like a board or a democratic kind of thing, it would allow them to have that title of executive director that they would list on a grant proposal or be the face of the organization for a certain amount of time. Although they were co-executive directors, they would take turns in kind of leadership of the organization over like a 1 or 2 year period, and they would switch back and forth. From all outside perspectives, me not long being on the board anymore, they've been in those positions for over 5 years now, where we were rotating executive directors probably every year and a half, 2 years. They'd get in there, they'd realize what they were up against. They would see that as a monumental. They were often not connected with the community. And so I think this cohabitation of the executive director seat really allowed them to expand, change the direction of the museum, make it more of a learning center and an open and equitable kind of place that people could not only learn about history, but art and science in the area. So I think it was a good move by them. And I think it's kind of a model that is appealing. I have seen organizations that fall under that, traditional hierarchy. And there's a myriad of reasons why it's successful, but I think the things that I've seen make it unsuccessful have been nepotism. If an executive director has a relative or a sibling or a son or daughter that works at the organization, there can often be nepotism behind that, and they can be raised up. The other thing is the executive director really sets the tone and the kind of goals of the organization. And if you have just one person doing that and they're, say, focused on like fundraising or grant proposals, you can get away from what managers and directors see on the front lines of administering those types of programs. And if they're not receptive to the feedback that you're getting from, quote unquote, the lower ranks or somebody that's in the field working on that, you can get away from really good work and just come chasing after dollars to programs that may not be the best suited for delivery of service or the delivery of your nonprofit's offerings. So I would like to see, even if you're in, something to think about for our listeners, if you do have a traditional kind of hierarchy with an executive director leading the charge, is to make those at the very least include staff and directors, people that are on the front lines in decision making about what grants and projects you're going to be picking up and how those services are delivered, because often they know better than an executive director who may be involved in some of those programs and may be involved maybe in some of it, but the job of an executive director often falls towards the management of the nonprofit and not so much in the weeds of working in projects, although their time sometimes is spent doing that. The real focus is managing the nonprofit, much like a CEO of a for-profit business. So I think having that connection with staff and people that are really running those programs is vital. Even if you don't take the suggestion of, totally democratizing the executive positions in the organization. I notice one thing they don't talk about democratizing is the accounting function, because I don't necessarily know how much you would have democracy say over how GAAP and nonprofit accounting rules would flow through your organization. So just be aware. I don't think you can do it with all things. You can't democratize HR. You really need somebody that's leading that charge and looking out for the best interest of workers and the organization. But I think from a leadership stance, it makes sense. And I agree with a lot of what she's talking about and have seen it actually work in practice. So interesting article though, Mark. I'd love your take on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think you bring up some great points, AJ. And I think one of the things that comes to mind as you were talking about this is it really depends on how your nonprofit is structured, right? Are you collaborative or are you hierarchical? And there are nonprofits that truly within their mission, vision, values have collaboration built into the model. And it's not just lip service, right? Because everybody says, oh, we're so collaborative. But when the rubber meets the road, that's not really the case. But if you have an organization that really benefits from this deep level of collaboration, having a distributed leadership seems like AJ was saying, you cover all your bases. You have people with different strengths in different areas. You have people, who have to get their egos out of the way and realize, I'm not going to be in this role forever. I'm here to kind of bring my expertise to it. And even if I cycle out of this role, I'm still going to have a say in what is going on in this organization. But really, it's going to be it's got to be a true collaborative mission that's going on there and not just performative, right? And in the for-profit sector, when you were talking about the co-executive directors, the recent example that comes to mind in the for-profit sector is when Blizzard Entertainment Group tried this with 2 co-executive CEOs. And, they were in the middle of this big kerfuffle because, there were top executives who were accused of some serious harassment and horrible workplace issues. So what did they do? They decided to have, they ousted the current CEO and brought in a co-executive in the form of a woman and a man leading Blizzard together. That lasted about 4 months, because the female, after she left the organization, said, this was all for show. This was all performative. There was no real co-leadership. Nobody was listening to her. And I would probably wager dollars to donuts if you looked at their paycheck, she was probably getting a lot less than he was. So at the end of the day, this gentleman is still there now as leading the charge all by himself. And it doesn't work if it doesn't work, right? If it's just the alpha position is still there, but they want to kind of look to the outside like they're doing something collaborative. Consensus is hard, and you really have to buy into it. And you really have to know how the consensus model works. And, are you looking for a democracy where it's majority rule, or are you looking for consensus where it's unanimity, where everybody has to be on the same page? Because if that's the case, then a lot of things won't get done, because getting everybody to agree that this is the way we spend our services, our man hours, our money, that's hard. So consensus building is a whole nother topic we could discuss, but I think it's an interesting exercise nonetheless, and probably something nonprofits should discuss. Like, is this model something that would appeal to us, to our donor base, to grantors, and help relieve some of that stress and overload and turnover that often happens in organizations like these. So on that note, AJ, our second article.
Yeah, so this one comes our way of our favorite Stanford Social Innovation Review, SSIR, and it's an article that's titled Reimagining the Request for Proposal. So RFPs, if you're listening to this and you're in the nonprofit space, you probably think of like an RFP from, most of the time they come from a request for proposal. They're solicitations that outline, they're asking you to apply for either a grant or contract. These usually come through government agencies are notorious for requesting these requests for proposals. And then they do a competitive bid sort of thing and pick, based off of narrative, price, and what you're doing, who it is, to man the grant money that's afforded to them. It also comes from like grantors and nonprofits itself. If a nonprofit needs, an auxiliary service to deliver on a grant or a proposal, they'll often have requests for proposals from other nonprofits or subcontractors to be able to work with them. And so this has kind of been the modus operandum for as long as I can remember, but for quite a while, this request for proposal goes on, and it's often done through written contracts and you're asked to conceptualize and outline the potential project of work in a proposal and tell them how much it's going to cost, and then it's sent to a decision-making body for evaluation, and then once they choose the request for proposal they like, it's handed out. So they're talking about reimagining this, and the reason why they're talking about it is, in most cases, these requests for proposals, it's kind of, first of all, finding how to get to a request for proposal is often daunting. It's also spread through social circles. There's not like a website aggregator that you can go to and see these. I mean, heck, governmental requests for proposals still get put in the newspaper for legal reasons. So often you'll see nonprofits still subscribing to a newspaper to pull up requests for proposals, but they're found on like obscure websites, the nonprofit's website. And what that does is it narrows the reach of who is seeing these requests for proposal initiatives and who can apply for them. And it's often then relegated to friends, close social circles, and, essentially a network of nonprofits and leaders that revolve in this kind of space. And if you're not invited to that space, then you don't get to apply for these requests for proposals. So the author is arguing that it needs to be rethought so that more diverse organizations that maybe don't have that social structure and adjust the request for proposal so you're not just choosing like-minded or like-looking kind of applicants and then awarding them something that maybe they're not that skilled in, but that that person or whatever it is through your social contacts. And so they lay out three kind of ways to change this. The first one is they must engage in community correction, and the scope of a project, including the problem definition, must emerge from the community. So they're asking for more community input on the request for proposals and what they would like to see the outcome and the methods used for delivering the services. Second, they want to focus on challenges or potential opportunities rather than determining the so-called solutions and deliverables. Often when you get these requests for proposals, you're locked into, you're on a set of tracks. You can veer left or right too much, but you can't completely go off track from what they've proposed. And so they're asking for more freedom for those applying for those grants to be able to better direct how they're going to do their work instead of being locked into a very rigid set of expectations, procedures, and deliverables. And then the third is that they should provide an important opportunity to share power and influence how resources are redistributed. They want to avoid like unpaid labor altogether. It can be difficult when you say your organization relies on volunteers, but they want to see that somehow these people are rewarded for the important work that they're doing. And they want to see the links and words reduce the amount of time invested. So they want to see a quicker turnaround on the proposals. But I think, the article offers a lot of good solutions, I think, but often, as we found on this podcast, it may be hard to totally change the process, this entrenched kind of process that's there, especially in the governmental setting. So, Mark, I'll let you weigh in on this and let me know what you think on it. And I think, reimagining the RFP process is probably something we could do a whole podcast on, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on it.
Yeah. The article, I think, fundamentally has a few flaws because it's reimagining the RFP process. There doesn't need to be a reimagining, right? The suggestions that are made by the author, I don't think are bad ones, but that can just be part of your RFP process. It's not like we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You still need some sort of bidding process in place. And I have concerns that by restructuring the whole thing, you are going to make the RFP process long and cumbersome, right? Because especially, things like getting community input, right? let's say I'm sending an RFP out because I need to, with due diligence, request proposals from auditors every 3 years to see if I want a new auditor, to see if there are competitive bids out there, et cetera, et cetera. Do I need community input for that? Do I need to go out there and make sure that the audit firm that I'm proposing to has X, Y, and Z, of their demographics, and and then ask the community for input and say, should I be using this auditor? They don't care, right? So I get it if you're doing a capital campaign, or if you're doing, a larger project that you want to make sure that diversity is inclusive, that, that the community is involved. But by reimagining this RFP process and inserting these kind of 3 steps, it can get very cumbersome. Now, I, as evidenced in this podcast, I'm all for diversity. I'm all for inclusion. I'm all for including and making sure that you are paying attention to getting your information out to sources where you're going to reach a broad band of people. And maybe that's the rethinking that needs to happen. How do we include in the RFP process more people? But, kind of saying it's strange, because I get where the author is coming from, and that as change, she is interested in a change coming in this sphere. But it's kind of like saying, well, the change is that we're going to do this from within our organization, and we're going to have the change start here. But then you're expecting all of the vendors to participate in that change when they might not have buy-in to your quote unquote new RFP process. So, I think there needs to be an infrastructure change, and you really need to, if you start requiring this, you're going to slow business and the process way down. And I get not wanting to have nepotism, or hiring all the same people who you have always hired, or hiring people who look exactly the same and are in the same demographic as you. That's all very important, but I don't know that it starts at the RFP level, I guess is what I'm saying. AJ, what do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think, from a nonprofit's perspective, if you need to hire a subcontractor or another nonprofit to supplement a grant that you're doing, you have full range not to do an RFP. You can go engage or find nonprofits that fit whatever necessary subcontracting you need. Now, if it's a federal grant, you'll need to document that you did some kind of like due diligence on price and competitiveness on that. But at the end of the day, you can choose somebody that's not the least expensive for other reasons and document them and put that in there, saying, we really wanted to promote a nonprofit with a person of color and leadership, and that works with minority groups in this sector, because that's what we're going after. And that's why we chose nonprofit B over nonprofit A, even though their contract price was $5,000 more. So you have, as a nonprofit, you really have control over that process of bringing in sub-recipients or subcontractors. It has to fall under the original grant agreement that you're in, but you have the power to be able to, bring on that. The flip side can't be said when you're applying for grants or contracts with state or government agencies, or even other grantors. I think you're really stuck. You can't say, I'd really like to apply for this $2 million grant, but you guys accept RFPs, so push off. I don't think you're, I would hope that your nonprofit wouldn't, obscure from an opportunity like that just because they're requesting an RFP. I would say trying to go through that process. And if you're one of those people in those social circles and thinks it's unfair, bring in more people into that social circle and introduce those people that are doing the RFPs to organizations that you think are deserving of the work. Take a step aside and let those people kind of lead a charge, or collaborate with them to do it in unison, and allow them the networking opportunity to be able to get their foot in the door for for these RFP processes that not a lot of people are aware of. So I think, passing that knowledge on and passing those connections on, it comes back to you twofold. I think you get out what you put in. And so including other people in that process, if you want to see the change, be the change. I know it sounds corny, but, if you're doing lots of work and your nonprofit is tapped out and you want to bring in contractors to do more work and you have the connection to bring in those contracts, then coordinate with an adjacent nonprofit or somebody that you were hoping to work with and allow them the opportunity to get in there. It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to follow a strict guideline around requests for proposals. And like Mark said, often when nonprofits think of requests for proposals, it's for auditors. And you definitely don't need community buy-in on who's doing your audit. You know what I mean? You need board buy-off, but not your core demographic of who you're serving needs to know who your auditor is and, you know, what their ethnicity makeup is or where they sit on the fence politically. You're paying for compliance and an audit. You know, it's not the same way if you had a request for proposal for janitors. Do you really need to know who and what the janitor is doing? I mean, come on, you know, like there's a point where I think there's a lot of time and effort spent on and RFPs take a lot of time and effort. Do you really need to do one for every small contract that you sign in a nonprofit? I would say no. You know, I think choosing somebody that you like or choosing somebody that you have worked with in the past or that is going to complete the need that you have for a good price and something that doesn't affect the way you deliver services, you can almost cut out the RFP altogether and pick who you would like to work with. So I don't know. That's just my 2 cents. Mark, do you have our next article for us?
You bet, AJ. This one comes from Philanthropy Daily. Karen Garvin has an article called Navigating Nonprofit Messaging and Negative Stereotypes. This was really an interesting one to me because this kind of was eye-opening in a way that was like, you know, I've never really thought critically about kind of messaging in some of the ways that this article is suggesting. So let me just give you the basic thesis here. If your organization's messaging isn't frank about the challenges that people you serve are facing, you can't build a case for support. However, if your message makes this population out to be one-dimensional, your fundraising raises a host of ethical questions. So I'll give the example that she gave to kind of lay out what's going on here. And the nonprofit sphere she mentions here is raising money for aid, often food aid in Africa, right? And you can see that there are ways to do that where it's empowering, where, you know, I'm thinking of, gosh, AJ, I can't even remember the name of that nonprofit where you can buy an animal that goes to a nonprofit or, you know, goes to a community out there so that they can raise livestock and feed themselves and, you know, whatever. So
I can't think of
which one I'm talking about. I can't remember.
I know which one you're talking about. I can't think of it either, though.
The audience is all screaming at their podcast. Anyway, but then there's also your Sally Struthers, like, you know, the one that Jan Hooks on SNL used to make fun of. Please send money to wherever money is needed, right? Where you see the starving kids in Africa with the flies all over their face. And that is not, the second example is not respectful to the population you're serving, not respectful to, you know, your organization, because you're effectively trying to tug the heartstrings in a way that's going to make people feel bad if they don't contribute. Whereas the empowering message still gives people the ability to give, but feel good about giving and knowing that their support is helping to create, you know, a better community. And then the people you're serving would probably look at both of those messages and say, yeah, I want to be seen as somebody who is empowered and not just somebody who is a starving person with flies all over my face. So the article, not very long, but it talks about maintaining the dignity of people you're serving and, you know, and having that go out to your fundraising, having that go out, you know, when you're speaking of the organization. It's not about shock value. It's about maintaining integrity. And that is what's going to keep people there for the long haul, you know, to really keep them engaged and keep them, you know, interested. And what a couple quick tips that she gives at the end of the article, and I'm going to add a fourth myself because I have a little experience with this, but the first one is take the time to conduct thoughtful interviews with the people you're serving. So figure out who they are and figure out what their needs are, and you know, that goes a long way. Number two, when visiting the people you serve and conducting interviews, take photographs with their permission instead of relying on stock images. So another great example, try to get involved with the people who you're serving and make them a part of the campaign and not just use, some random iStock photo of somebody starving, which just doesn't serve anybody. And then 3, assess your current marketing and create a style guide that outlines words and phrases to use or avoids and gives directions for graphic and overall tone. So, that is more creating a brand for yourself of what your advertising is going to look like, so that you don't have some rogue marketing person come in and say, hey, I need a quick boost of money. Let's use this image because we know it'll really get them in the heartstrings, right? And my 4th tip that I'm going to give, which they kind of mentioned but didn't use as a tip, is talking about people-centric languaging when you're advertising or you're marketing, right? So instead of talking about homeless people, you could talk about people experiencing homelessness. I know, because I work with a nonprofit for a nonprofit that has clients who have brain injury, and we never, you hear it all the time from even some donors. Oh, how are the brain injured doing? And these are people who happen to have a brain injury, but they are not their injury. They are not their disease. They are not their malady. So actually having the dignity and respect of coming at your client base and saying, this is a person experiencing homelessness. We're here to serve people who happen to be X, Y, and Z, I think goes a long way to kind of bolstering that idea of dignity and respect. So I like this article. I think it in a concise way really, really brings these messages to light. AJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I used to work with a nonprofit that dealt with the houseless or people experiencing homelessness, as you just mentioned, as a good tagline instead of homeless. And what they would do in their marketing is and this was a large nonprofit that helped transition people from living on the street to having stable housing and getting their any kind of legal items fixed up, and then put them on a path to a sustainable job practice and then housing that they were able to afford. And they would follow them over like a year or so journey on this. And their marketing was essentially taking a dignified photo of them as they came into the program and getting their life, essentially the story of how they were helped and how they regained a life that that they knew before they were homeless. And then they would take kind of show them in the picture after they had gone through this process, and really humanizing who it was. We can often think, if you're donating to the somebody that is experiencing homelessness, that they're just some vague shell of a person that's living in a tent on the side of the road, and really humanizing them and letting people know and keeping the dignity of those people, allowing them to come into a space where they ask for help and have help delivered to them, I think is really important. And it's something, like Mark said, I wasn't thinking about when I read this article. I'm not a marketer at heart, but often if you would have asked me, I would have thought, a really disheveled person living on the street, a photo of that would tug at somebody's heartstring to try and get them to donate, but it removes the dignity of that person that's, experiencing homelessness. And so I think, keeping that in mind and keeping the population that you serve's dignity around it. Nobody likes to ask for a handout or a hand up. And so often it's making sure that those people are heard and seen and treated with the respect that they deserve. And I thought it was a really good article on the tips that she mentions. I think, and the tip that Mark made are really key and vital if you're thinking about putting this stuff out, and regardless of what nonprofit space you're in, and providing people with the type of resources and dignity that they need, and showing them as who they truly are. I think it's I don't have anything negative to say about the article at all for once.
Yeah, and hat tip to our crack researcher, AJ Wheeler, who told me that the name of our nonprofit I was talking about earlier, Heifer International. So check them out if you want to see what we're talking about with this kind of dignified messaging, because I think they do a great job with that. And, I have to say, on a few occasions, I've bought somebody a beehive for their birthday, and they're like, that is the weirdest gift, but pretty cool. So anyway, AJ, I think we have some questions this week.
Yeah, we do. We got a couple revolving around QuickBooks. So, first question is comes in. It's who has access to QuickBooks. So, this is a person that works as kind of a contractor, as such as we do, but more of a software contractor, and they're going through and kind of reworking the GL and data mapping of this nonprofit's QuickBooks. And what they came across was that they have a very eager board that wants to be involved with the nonprofit. And what they found was that a lot of people have access to the QuickBooks file. They don't get into detail about what level of access those people have, but they're asking the question, how many and who should have access to view the details of the QuickBooks file or your accounting records? And I thought it was an interesting question. I know I have a answer for this, or at least, kind of what I think should be, the who should have access to that. But Mark, I'll give you a shot. We have another question, so I'll give you a shot here at answering this one, and I can chime in. But yeah, I'd love to know your take on this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think our questions are related, and they're both kind of how do we manage QuickBooks. And frankly, Intuit and the folks at QuickBooks, I would call them the fine folks, but we all know if we've listened, I don't think they're quite fine. Anyway, I think the folks at QuickBooks are kind of the biggest game in town, right? Unless you are big enough to have your own software that you're paying for, financial software. And once you reach a certain size in your nonprofit, that often happens. But if you're just starting out, or you're even up to mid-size, often QuickBooks is what you're using. And so how do we know who should have access to QuickBooks? Well, the answer is really only a select few, only those who are needing the information and are working there as accountants. I think handing out keys or handing out, especially if you're sharing username and passwords with people so that they can get in there and do QuickBooks, is problematic, right? The structure, the framework of QuickBooks in and of itself, for those who are not necessarily in the know, is such that you can go in there and make changes. And if you haven't locked down past periods, you can often make changes to prior periods. I've seen prior years without the consent or consulting of other people. And if you haven't closed prior months, if you have somebody who's not so experienced in accounting, they can go in there and really screw up your books. And even if they're just given informational access, QuickBooks sometimes doesn't look at that and doesn't pay attention to that. And then if you run an audit trail to see who's done what, well, that's helpful if you're all using different logins. But if you're all using the same login, then all of a sudden it just looks like whatever admin, made this change. So I think it sets a super dangerous precedent. And the more hands you have in the cooking process, the less reliable the product on the other side is. So, I would say who should have access to QuickBooks? That would be your CFO, if you have one, your accountant, and, I wouldn't even say your executive director or anybody at the top needs access besides the CFO. They can request reports whenever they want to, but I don't think you want anybody in development or people who don't, unless you're serving a dual role, of course. But I'm very proprietary as to who has access to QuickBooks, and I'm pretty staunch about making sure that everybody has their own login, so that if errors happen, it's not necessarily, sometimes people just don't know, but you want to be able to train and say, oh, no, we don't make those kind of changes, or no, we don't post directly to the accounts payable account. Those kinds of accounting related questions that people who don't have accounting knowledge just won't know. So that's my initial take. AJ, how about you?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said there. I do think, providing somebody like a read-only access, to it, in an executive position might be okay if they're asking a lot of nitpicky questions that they can maybe go in there and solve themselves to try and save some time. But like what Mark said, you're opening yourself up for, I guess, more questions or more nitpicking. I guess if you turn the reins over, it might be easier to redirect those people and try to understand where they're coming from, to try and maybe cut that off before you get to it. But I also think if you're and I'm going to say this, it depends on your size. If you're a really really small nonprofit, like say you only have an executive director that moonlights as a bookkeeper for the organization, you may want to give like the treasurer of the board access to be able to go back and review things without having to constantly ask for reports on stuff. But there's, like Mark said, there's other ways to do that. If you're a very small nonprofit that has one person in charge of the accounting, I would think you would want some complementary controls or some overriding controls in that situation, and have the board review all money in and money out, via bank rec, and ask questions about that for support if there's something that seems out of line. If you have one person in a place where they could really usurp some kind of control and take money. But from an established nonprofit that has at least an accounting department, you need some kind of oversight on them, but I don't think it needs to be done through access to QuickBooks, because like Mark said, if you are not confident in how you have your accounting system walled off, somebody willy-nilly going in there and clicking around can cause all kinds of havoc that can create extra work and screw up prior periods if they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, AJ, and I totally forgot to mention it, but you just reminded me. Fraud, right?
Yeah.
There's access to fraud, right? If somebody's able to go in there and squirrel away some money, and they have access to QuickBooks, and they can just make a quick journal entry using the admin login and just say, oh yeah, that was a legitimate expense with no oversight.
Set up a vendor,
huge problem, right? Set up vendors, do all,
So it's something you want to look out for. I mean, your accounting records, need to be locked down. And you need to know who has access to it. And like Mark said, you need to be able to understand who made what transaction, not necessarily so you can punish them, but so, if fraud happens, at least there's some kind of paper trail that you can trace it back to the person that perpetrated it, and not sharing logins or having a universal login that everybody knows totally blows any kind of audit trail or examination of what happened by a person to be able to go back and look at it. So, which leads nicely into our next segment about reporting, I think. So our other question here is misuse or use of QuickBooks. So this is somebody that they're not involved in the day-to-day operations. It sounds like they're a program manager, and they want to have the most up-to-date financial data available. And they're wanting to know if QuickBooks is the right tool to do that, or should they be managing like their grant money differently? And right now they try to manage budgets and spreadsheets, and that's all right, but it seems like they should all roll up into QuickBooks, or is that not the point of QuickBooks? So they're a non-accountant asking an accountant question, and they want to know essentially how they should manage, how they should help or suggest their accounting department help them manage their programmatic or granting funds from this. And so Mark, I'll let you take a stab at this one first too. I actually wrote this respondent back a personalized response that we can get into a little bit too. So
yeah, I think upon first blush, it seems like this is potentially a nonprofit that is on the cusp of needing a more robust accounting software. Like QuickBooks has its uses, and it even has a nonprofit function, but it isn't the best when it comes to budgeting. It isn't the best when it comes to tracking specific projects. And, again, a little bit of QuickBooks knowledge. You have two different products. You have QuickBooks Desktop and you have QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks Online is the preferred method that Intuit wants everybody to use, of course, because they want that recurring revenue to keep coming in every month. So they're kind of pushing everybody over into that. I think with QuickBooks Desktop, they had a more robust budgeting system. It was easier to use budget versus actual in the programs, and it was easier to create classes and have specific ways of accounting for different programmatic things. Now, QuickBooks Online still can do that, but you're paying extra to be able to use classes. It's not as feature rich on the base level. And I think personally, if you're not quite ready to take the financial leap to go to another layer of software, I think managing this in a spreadsheet is perfectly fine, especially if you have like a shared document, either via Excel or via Google Sheets, where people can all view it at the same time. People can be working on it together. That's often something that helps with collaboration that you really can't do live working on something together in QuickBooks. It's not created or meant to do that. And I think, the problem that I often see in nonprofits is that they want one software to do everything. And what my experience has been is that when you try to go that route, you might find it, but that software doesn't do anything particularly well, right? You have a broad brush that's kind of mediocre at all these levels. And, the bane of my accounting existence is QuickBooks Payroll. And I think QuickBooks is fine when it comes to accounting for day-to-day transactions. But if anybody ever asked me if I would recommend QuickBooks Payroll, I would not just say no, I would say hell no. It is a terrible product that has cost my clients hours and hours on the phone with me trying to fix things. And just a short aside, I had a recent client who was told by the fine people at QuickBooks that a health insurance was, just standard health insurance was a post-tax deduction. And so we had to go in and unwind all their incorrect information that they received. And it was a nightmare. And it's just because the customer service in the payroll department is atrocious. And I'm getting way off on a side tangent, but no, for QuickBooks, it is meant to do specific things, and don't necessarily try to push the envelope and make it do more than it's actually capable of doing. AJ.
As I pull Mark off of his QuickBooks Payroll soapbox here, I do have to agree. Payroll, if you're a very small organization and you have, QuickBooks Payroll is not the best. But back to this person's question here, I think from the point of what they're really talking about is, I think first it's good to educate if you're in the accounting department of a nonprofit or you're a nonprofit accountant, is to educate what up-to-date information means. You need a monthly close. You don't want to allow somebody or try to give somebody mid-month or midstream of unfinished kind of financial data, because it won't be an accurate representation of up-to-date financial information. When you're giving out a budget to actual or something, it needs to be for a period that you have closed. You've gone through and adjusted all the liabilities, made sure that you're not missing any accruals, and that you've made releases of accruals for that close period. And then to be able to provide, especially like a programmatic person like this, a budget to actual. And as Mark alluded to, the budget software that QuickBooks offers is lacking at best in QuickBooks Online. And the reason being is you can import from a budget, of Excel, an overall organizational budget. But if you want department or class budgets, you have to enter them in one at a time by hand, class by class by class. And that can be time consuming if you have 50 different grants that you're tracking in a class system. So it might be easier to do a dump at the end of every month of a budget to actual year to date or grant to date kind of thing, and pop those into an Excel thing and provide your program people with your budget to actual, so that they have a good idea of how much payroll they have left, supplies left in that grant, and make sure they're on target to meet those. I think that's probably where most nonprofits, and I think it's totally all right to manage those in an Excel sheet or a Google Doc and allow those people and have a time frame of when that's going to be done. We'll close the books by the 15th of the following month, have your budget actuals by the end of the month so that you can review them, and I think setting up realistic timetables like that and allowing programmatic staff to understand what's left on their budget is really key, and I think involving program staff onto what they need to manage their programs and have an open dialogue between accounting and the program staff, and not just have accounting as this walled garden of, I give you the information I give you. You have to be able to collaborate with these folks, especially in a nonprofit setting, to understand what their needs are from a programmatic standpoint on what information they need out of the system. And that may be a combination of not just accounting data, but it may be some other tracking software that you use outside of the accounting system for number of people served. If they have a certain minimum standard or a minimum requirement of how many people they serve on a monthly, quarterly, yearly contract basis, that kind of information won't be tracked and is not tracked in QuickBooks. So understanding, where that information needs to come from and what requirements, your programmatic staff need to fulfill their grants and contract requirements is vital. That accounting is a part of that, but it's not the end all be all, and so, deploying the proper type of technology or tracking software to be able to track participants in a grant, versus the financial information that comes from the accounting system versus payroll system versus HR software versus, we can go on and on and on of a technology stack that's deployed to be able to manage and number these things. But I think the main thing is to have the executive group as a group with the programmatic staff be involved in that and crafting what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add to that, AJ, to kind of loop both of these questions together, manage expectations, right? Because these questions are talking about up-to-date financial information. Well, if I am managing an accounting department, I want my accountants to be able to have the correct information in there, but not to feel like I have to get this right immediately. I have to get the coding correct. There is a review process that happens at month end, and sometimes if you have somebody who has access to QuickBooks, they're just popping in there and they're going, oh, well, I see this expense has been paid. Well, something might be accrued but not paid, and they're looking on a P&L and they think it's paid. And, people don't necessarily understand financial information. So managing expectations, and like AJ was saying, create a dialogue with people where it's like, I can get you this information at the end of the month. You don't want people just jumping into your QuickBooks to try to figure out what's going on for themselves. That's what you have an accounting department for. So that would be the final piece I would add to that. And I think with that brings us to another episode, to a close of another episode of Profitless on Purpose. We certainly appreciate you being with us. As always, please comment on the YouTube video or tweet at us at ProfitlessPod. We often will engage with your questions coming in. So the more you contribute, your question could be read next time on the podcast. So on behalf of AJ Wheeler and myself, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.